Nigeria, 1969.
If you were standing in the streets of Lagos, you wouldn't hear the sounds of progress. You would hear the sound of a country tearing itself apart. The Biafran War was not just a conflict, it was a humanitarian black hole. Over 2 million people, mostly civilians, mostly children, were starving to death. It was a war that the world had decided to ignore. The United Nations was silent. The superpowers were indifferent. But in the middle of this darkness, an impossible rumour began to float through the palm groves and the humid city squares. To understand why a soccer match mattered, we have to understand the blood on the ground. The conflict began in 1967 when the eastern region of Nigeria, led by Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, declared independence as the Republic of Biafra. The federal government, led by Yakubu Gowon, responded with a total blockade. No food, no medicine, no mercy. By 1969, the Biafran baby had become the global face of suffering. The photos of emaciated children were the first time the world truly saw the cost of modern civil war on its television screens. The hatred was deep. The ethnic divisions between the Igbo, the Hausa, and the Yoruba were thought to be permanent. But then, the news broke. Santos FC, the most famous team on earth, was coming to Nigeria. And they weren't just coming for a friendly. They were flying directly into the heart of the killing fields. The world held its breath. Why would the greatest athlete on the planet, Edson Arantes do Nascimento, Pelé, risk his life for a match that didn't even count in the standings? The answer lies not in politics, but in the strange, frantic world of 1960s Brazilian football. In 1969, Santos FC was less a football club and more a travelling commercial empire. Pelé was the most expensive athlete in history. To keep him in Brazil and away from the massive wallets of European giants like Real Madrid or Inter Milan, the club had to pay him a salary that was, frankly, unsustainable. The solution? The world tour. Santos became the Harlem Globetrotters of soccer. They would play anyone, anywhere, as long as the check cleared. The schedule was grueling. In the early months of 1969 alone, the team played 22 matches in 40 days across Africa, Europe, and Asia. The players were exhausted. They lived out of suitcases, eating strange food and sleeping in hotels that were often under-equipped. Pelé later admitted that he sometimes didn't know which country he was in when he woke up. But in Africa, the reception was different. In Congo, in Mozambique, in Algeria, Pelé wasn't just a player. He was a symbol of black excellence in a post-colonial world. He was a king returning home. When the invitation came from Nigeria, the Santos board hesitated. There was a war on. But the money was right, and the prestige was even better. The Nigerian Football Federation promised that for 48 hours the guns would fall silent. It was a promise that seemed like madness. How do you tell a soldier in a trench to stop shooting just because a man is good with a ball? But as the Santos plane crossed the Nigerian border, the impossible began to take shape. To understand the sheer absurdity of the Nigerian ceasefire, one must first understand the men holding the triggers. On one side, General Yakubu Gowon, the British-educated, Sandhurst-trained head of the federal military government. On the other, Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, the Oxford-educated son of a billionaire who had led the secession of Biafra. These were not merely soldiers, they were rivals in a chess match where the board was a nation and the pieces were millions of lives. By January 1969, neither man was in the mood for mercy. The war had reached a bloody stalemate. Yet, when the name Pelé was whispered in the corridors of power, The stalemate blinked. The legend, as it has been told for 50 years, is poetic. It claims that a formal ceasefire was signed, that for 48 hours the machinery of death ground to a halt. It is a story that has become the bedrock of Pelé's legacy, but as any historian worth their salt will tell you, the truth is far more slippery. There is no paper trail. There are no signed treaties in the archives of Lagos or Enugu. The truce was not a document. It was a vibe. It was a collective, unspoken agreement that even a civil war was secondary to a miracle. The logistics were a nightmare of paranoia. How do you guarantee the safety of the world's most valuable athlete in a city under constant threat of air raids? Gowon's government poured resources into the security detail. The road from the airport to the stadium was lined with the very soldiers who, just days before, had been on the front lines. But it wasn't just the federal side. The Biafran rebels, the men who were being hunted, reportedly sent word through back channels. They wouldn't attack, not while the king was on the pitch. They wanted to see him too. They wanted, for just 2 hours, to remember a world where the only thing that crossed a border was a ball. When the Santos plane finally touched down on the tarmac in Lagos, the tension was so thick it was almost tactile. The players, led by Lima and Gilmar, looked out the windows and saw a sea of camouflage. They wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. Pelé, however, was calm. He had seen this before. In the Congo, in Mozambique, in Algeria, he had seen how his presence could act as a temporary anesthetic for the pain of a continent. But Nigeria was different. Nigeria was a wound that refused to close. But let us pause the myth for a moment. Modern critics often ask, was the war truly stopped? The answer is likely no. In the deep bush, far from the floodlights of Lagos, the hunger didn't stop. The blockades didn't lift. But in the psychological center of the nation, the war was paused. For those 48 hours, the headlines weren't about casualty counts or territory gained. They were about the grace of a man who could make a ball dance. It was a tactical peace, a moment where the human spirit was allowed to override the military machine. Pelé was more than a player that week. He was a diplomat in a white jersey. He knew that if he played poorly, the spell would break. He knew that the weight of the ceasefire rested on his shoulders. Every touch, every pass, every smile was a brick in a temporary wall built against the chaos. As he walked into the dressing room for the first match, he could hear the crowd, not just the fans, but the soldiers, chanting his name. The king was in the building. And for now, the guns were silent. The heat in Lagos on January 26, 1969, was a physical weight. It wasn't just the humidity of the Nigerian coast, it was the friction of 10,000 bodies packed into a stadium built for far fewer. The city stadium was a pressure cooker of expectation. Soldiers in starched green fatigues stood at the perimeter, their rifles leaning against their hips, not aimed at the crowd, but resting for once. The air smelled of diesel, roasted maize, and the metallic tang of impending history. In the dressing room, the Santos players could hear a sound they had never encountered before, a rhythmic, booming chant that seemed to shake the very foundations of the concrete walls. Pelé! Pelé! It wasn't a cheer, it was a summons. When the king finally emerged from the tunnel, the noise didn't just increase, it transformed. It became a roar that reportedly could be heard miles away, past the military checkpoints and into the slums where the war was a daily visitor. Pelé stepped onto the grass, and for a moment he stopped. He looked at the stands, at the men who had come from the front lines, their faces etched with the fatigue of the trenches, and at the children who had seen things no child should ever see. He knew then that this wasn't a friendly. This was a responsibility. He adjusted his captain's armchair, looked at his teammates, Edu, Lima, and the veteran Gilmar, and gave a single, sharp nod. The ball was placed on the centre circle. The whistle blew. And for 90 minutes, the Nigerian Civil War ceased to exist. The match itself was a masterpiece of tension. The Green Eagles of Nigeria weren't there to simply be spectators to greatness. They were a formidable side, desperate to prove they could stand toe-to-toe with the Titans of Brazil. The Nigerians played with a ferocious, physical energy, pressing high and challenging every Santos touch. The pitch was uneven, the grass parched, making the legendary samba style of Santos difficult to execute. Every time Pelé touched the ball, the stadium went into a collective trance. He was marked by 2, sometimes 3 defenders, but he moved like water through a sieve. He wasn't just playing soccer. He was conducting an orchestra of movement, finding pockets of space that didn't seem to exist. Then it happened. The moment the 10,000 had come to witness. It began in the 20th minute. A botched clearance from the Nigerian defence landed at the feet of Lima, who didn't hesitate. He clipped a delicate lofted ball over the midfield line. Pelé was there. He didn't wait for it to drop. He cushioned the ball on his chest with a grace that felt almost offensive in its perfection. 2 defenders closed in, but with a flick of his right boot, a chapeau, he sent the ball over their heads. He caught it on the volley before it touched the dirt. The sound of the ball hitting the back of the net was lost instantly in the explosion of the crowd. The king had spoken. The goal didn't just change the scoreline, it changed the energy of the afternoon. In the stands, the rigid military discipline dissolved. Soldiers were seen hugging civilians. Enemies who had been hunting each other's families were suddenly high-fiving over a piece of Brazilian magic. This was the Pelé effect in its purest form, a temporary suspension of hatred through the medium of awe. Nigeria equalized later in the half, a gritty, determined goal that brought a different kind of roar, a roar of national pride. The score was 1-1 at the break. In the dressing room, the heat was suffocating, but Pelé sat in silence, staring at his boots. He knew the job wasn't done. He knew that as long as the score was level, the tension remained. The second half was a war of attrition. The Nigerian sun was relentless. Pelé, now 28 years old and at the peak of his powers, seemed to be everywhere. He scored a second, a clinical, low drive into the corner that silenced the stadium for a heartbeat before they erupted again. The match ended 2-2. A draw. A result that, in any other context, would be forgotten. But as the whistle blew, there was no disappointment. Thousands of fans poured onto the pitch, not in anger, but in a desperate need to touch the hem of the white jersey. Pelé was hoisted onto shoulders. He looked out over the sea of faces, one last time, and for a fleeting second he saw a Nigeria that was whole. The sun began to set over Lagos, casting long amber shadows across the concrete of the city stadium. The magic was beginning to dissolve. For the players of Santos, the adrenaline of the match was being replaced by a cold, creeping realization. They had to leave. As the team was hustled into a military-escorted convoy back to the airport, the atmosphere had shifted. The cheering fans were still there, lining the streets, but there was a desperation in their eyes now. They weren't just waving goodbye to a football team. They were waving goodbye to the peace. On the tarmac, the engines of the Douglas DC-6 began to whine. Pelé sat by the window, staring out at the Nigerian soil. According to his teammates, the cabin was silent. No one celebrated the 2-2 draw. No one talked about the goals. As the wheels left the ground and the plane banked over the dark expanse of the jungle, the myth met its end. Multiple accounts from the players, including the midfielder Lima, claim that as they gained altitude, they could see the flashes of muzzle fire in the trees below. The 48 hours were up. The guns were no longer silent. The tragedy of the Biafran War didn't end with a soccer match. It ended in January 1970, a year later, with a total Biafran surrender and a death toll that remains a scar on the conscience of the 20th century. Ojukwu fled into exile. Gowon declared, "No victor, no vanquished." But the hunger didn't vanish overnight, and the lives lost during those final months of fighting made the Pelé ceasefire feel like a cruel taunt to some. How could a game stop the killing for a weekend? But the world couldn't stop it for 3 years. This verses is where we must separate the man from the myth. If you search the archives of the Nigerian Daily Times or the Brazilian newspapers of 1969, you will find no official treaty. There is no signed document from the federal government or the Biafran rebels. Historians like Olaujo Ayegbayo have spent years digging for proof of a formal ceasefire, and they have come up empty-handed. Critics argued that the truce was a clever bit of PR, a story told by Santos to justify playing in a war zone, or a legend polished by Pelé's biographers to cement his status as a god. Was it all just a beautiful lie? But to dismiss it as a lie is to misunderstand the power of the beautiful game. Even if no general signed a paper, the testimony of the people who were there remains. The thousands who walked through war zones to reach that stadium. The soldiers who stood side by side with their enemies. Perhaps it wasn't a ceasefire in the legal sense. Perhaps it was something much more profound, a collective hallucination of peace. For those 90 minutes, the people of Nigeria decided that the game was more real than the war. And in that decision, the myth became a truth. Why does this story matter today, in 2026? In an age where sports are often reduced to betting odds, transfer fees, and corporate sponsorships, the story of Pelé in Nigeria reminds us of the raw, primal power of the sport. It tells us that soccer is the only language that can bypass a border, a blockade, or a bullet. Pelé didn't have a political agenda. He didn't have a peace plan. He simply had a ball and a smile. And in the darkest corner of the 60s, that was enough to make the world stop turning for a single, glorious afternoon. Edson Arantes do Nascimento left us in 2022, but the king never truly died. Every time a ball is kicked in a dirt lot in Lagos or a child in Brazil puts on a yellow jersey, the guns fall silent again. Because the story of Pelé and the ceasefire isn't about a war that happened 50 years ago. It's about a peace that is always possible, if only we are willing to play. For the beautiful game. For the king. Good night.